Okay, it's loading up. Okay, I believe we are live. Loading up. So, good afternoon, everyone. Europe, the UK, the world. Welcome to another session of Beyond the Balcony, Organizing for European Solidarity. In today's session, we will be talking to our organizers, coordinators, and fellow comrades from the United Kingdom. We're very happy to have them here, one of our oldest national collectives in DiEM25. It's really, we were having a bit of a brief before the call, and we're saying how these calls now for many of us feel a bit like family reunions, you know, all these familiar faces from the past 3-4 years and all the work we've been doing together. So without further ado, you know that the UK has been one of the countries in the forefront of the news cycle in the past few years in Europe with Brexit, lately with the handling of the coronavirus. All of these will be topics in today's discussion. We will be starting, before giving the floor to our members in the United Kingdom, we'll start with a brief introduction from Yanis. Just a reminder for everyone, this series of calls is Beyond the Balcony, is a series of calls between the coordinating collective of DiEM and our local organizers around Europe to discuss the current political situation in Europe, the world, and also our movement, DiEM25's position in these historic circumstances, what our response should be, what our positioning should be, how we can remain relevant in this very quickly changing world. So, without any further ado from me, the floor goes to Yanis. Yanis, off you go.
Well, thank you, Eric. Welcome all to this call. Let's just dispel with a question that needs to be set aside. It came from a number of DiEMers or friends in the United Kingdom who asked the question, well, now that we're out of the European Union, or with one leg out or 1.5 legs out, what's the point of DiEM in the UK? The answer is, DiEM is not about the European Union. DiEM is about democratizing Europe. We have never identified Europe with the European Union. Our position on the European Union is very clear, but nevertheless, we've had countries and members in DiEM that have nothing to do with the European Union, like Serbia, for that matter, Turkey. We have an active membership now in Turkey that fills our soul with joy. Comrades, friends in the United Kingdom, we really don't recognize Brexit. It's really very simple. We recognize it as a reality on the ground, but nothing to do with DiEM, our processes. Nothing changes with Brexit. I think that was rather an important starting statement. Now, remember how it all started. We started in February 2016 at the Foxbühne Theatre, and we launched DiEM25 with a slogan that was full of analysis as well at the same time. We said, Europe will be democratized, or the European Union in this sense, or it will disintegrate. And that applies both to the European Union and to Europe as an idea, as a realm of imagined shared prosperity. Now, we are facing a major paradox, which I think can be witnessed both across Europe and in the United Kingdom. It's a paradox that pits, on the one hand, how correct our analysis has always been, even if we're saying so ourselves. But I believe that our analysis was correct. In the European Union, we were saying that if they continue to practice socialism for the few and austerity for the many, if they continue to have processes that are, or decision-making processes that are profoundly anti-democratic, democracy-free zone, I call Brussels and the Troika and the Eurogroup and all that, the economic stagnation is going to create a nationalist international, and the whole project will prove the opposite of resilient. It will prove fragile, and the only ones who will benefit from that are the financiers who constantly get drip-fed by central banks and the fascists who unite across borders. When it comes to United Kingdom, I think that, if you look at the evolution of the DiEM25 narrative and policy agenda in the UK, we were completely spot on. We were right to fight against Brexit. We were right not to side with the hard remainers, with the David Camerons, the Tony Blairs, the George Osbornes, who were also on the Remain side. We were right to have to be absolutely reluctant, but at the same time steadfast supporters of Remain, or equivalently opponents of Brexit. We remember the question that was put to Jeremy Corbyn: how enthusiastic are you about the EU? And he said 6, 7, I think, out of 10. I would have said 2. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to fight for the European Union. In the same way, if you ask me how enthusiastic am I about the Greek state, or if somebody asks you how enthusiastic you are about the British state, you can give it a failing mark without that meaning that you want to disintegrate it. So our position was, we did not infantilize the electorate in the United Kingdom, unlike both the Remainers, the official Remain campaign that infantilized them, and the official Brexit campaign, or the Brexit campaign that definitely infantilized them. We identified Brexit as a serious weapon used by people like Dominic Cummings, Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, and others in order to, utilize and enhance xenophobia, push it to the limits of racism, or beyond the limits of xenophobia into the realm of racism, and fib. But of course, the hard Remain position was also doing the same thing. And we fought a good fight, and we added intellectual ammunition to the anti-Brexit cause in a way that I think has been registered in the minds of many progressives in the United Kingdom. Similarly, on the continent. Look at what happened the day after the Brexit referendum was lost to us. We came out, and as genuine Democrats, we did not propose a second referendum. We did not fall into the trap that Keir Starmer managed to drag the whole of the Labour Party in, because the second referendum idea was always going to be toxic, and this is why we resisted it. We came up with very sensible moderate plans, like, for instance, Norway Plus, which would have been a splendid improvement on what we have now, and which the hard Remainers and the second referendum crowd rejected out of hand. The result was a complete and utter political suicide. So, this is the paradox. On the one hand, our analysis was right, and our policy agenda, if you think about the Green New Deal for Europe, and for the UK as being part of Europe, forget the EU, looking back to the last 5 years, those ideas that sounded a little bit strange in 2016 when we were putting them across, now I think they have wide acceptance by even a majority of people in the United Kingdom, and indeed in Germany and other places. When we talk about the green transition works projects and the funding at 5%, the financial instruments that we've been proposing, the citizens' assemblies, the universal basic dividends, everything we've come out with in terms of policy recommendations has gained a great deal of traction. And yet, so where is the paradox? Paradox is we were right and thoroughly defeated. Well, this is a paradox that we need to investigate and interrogate and learn from, not only in the United Kingdom, but also across Europe, across the continent. A few points here regarding the United Kingdom in particular. The defeat of Jeremy Corbyn, which is partly because of the vilification campaign, but I think to a very large extent is due to the fact that Keir Starmer and the rest of the establishment within the Labour Party managed to shift the Corbynite Labour Party towards a second referendum. I think that was that just gave gave the whole game away and delivered victory to Boris Johnson. And now we have Keir Starmer leading the Labour Party, the person who effectively was the one that pushed in a little direction the policy platform of the Labour Party. I personally don't dislike Keir Starmer. I just think that, you know, he's a liability because of his support of the second referendum and the fact that even if he adopts the manifesto of the Labour Party, he's not going to do it with any degree of conviction. He will only do it in order to appease the new members of the Labour Party and momentum and so on. So we have, you know, the thing that he really believes in, he shouldn't believe in it. And the thing that he's going to be claiming he believes in, he doesn't believe in it. From DiEM's perspective, Jeremy Corbyn's loss and passing is a major defeat. We already had planned for this March a joint Labour Party DiEM25 conference in Brussels to discuss the Green New Deal and the Progressive International. That would have been magnificent. So across Europe, we have the same pattern repeating again and again, and we can discuss this. I don't want to keep talking for much longer. I want to pass the baton on to the rest of you, but I think 3 points. First, this paradox we need to learn from, and we need to overcome it. We can't continue to be correct and keep losing. Secondly, it is now time to bury the hatchet between Remainers and Leavers. Brexit is done, it's finished, it's gone. There's no point in continuing to fight, you know, the previous war. That went. I have no doubt that there will be no extension, personally, to this interim period. I think Johnson is going to use it in order to get out quickly. Personally, I don't think it's a bad idea because the European Union at the moment is completely paralyzed and they are not in any position to strike a mutually advantageous agreement with the United Kingdom. That's my own personal view. We can discuss it if you want, or you can ignore it if you wish. So we need to bury the hatchet. I'm very pleased to have seen Tariq Ali in one of the DiEM25 programs very recently, because he and I, as you know, clashed in front of a large audience in London in 2016, and it was not pleasant. Not so much what happened on stage, but what happened afterwards in the couple of years that followed. So this is hugely important. Even with Lexities on the continent of Europe, and the reason why I'm saying that is very simple. We can see now that the German establishment, the Dutch establishment, the oligarchy without borders across Europe, they are perfectly prepared to blow the European Union up if this is what is necessary in order to prevent any kind of financial instrument from being invented, implemented, used for the purposes of shifting wealth from the oligarchy to the poor. They are, the oligarchy, the ones who are wrapping themselves in the EU flag, are perfectly willing and ready to blow up the European Union if this is what will safeguard the oligarchy's interests. And they will always, you know, whenever we gain a position of power, whenever we win government, they will always threaten the rest of us with exit from the European Union, like they did in 2015 in my case. We must not put the maintenance of the European Union above the interests of the people. We're never going to propose Grexit, Fraxit, Italexit, Brexit, but at the same time, we're not going to be beaten into submission by an oligarchy that is prepared to blow up the European Union, but it is threatening us with exit. So this is the constructive disobedience part that should be the basis for a rapprochement between Lexiteers and DiEMers. And finally, comrades, we have to become far more radical. The coronavirus crisis reveals the complete limits, the surpassed limits of capitalism. We need to talk about nationalizing the banks now. We need to talk about a universal basic dividend that is funded not only through the dividends from shares that we put in an equity fund, but also directly through money printed by central banks. And we need to talk about post-capitalism, going beyond the private ownership of the means of production, as we once used to say. DiEM25 UK has a huge amount of work to do. We are weak at the moment, but our ideas are more necessary than ever. Our movement and the building up of our movement is more necessary than ever. And there is nothing else. The Labour Party is gone. The Green Party is non-existent, especially after they became part and parcel of the Lib Dems and the second, the hard Remain position. So it's DiEM25 or bust.
I will not dilute that statement with any intermediary comment. So I'm going to go directly to the next person who's requested the floor. We have Jack. Jack Franco, floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you for that. Thank you, Yanis, for that introduction. I thought that was a remarkably good place to start, because it was almost like watching a film of 2016 till now all over again. There was a story of ideas, action, and with both ending in defeat. And thinking of the two radical moments of the last 4 years, the December 2019 election and the referendum 2016, which both did end in defeat, we saw that the ideas that we proposed, the very rational, considered proposals that we put forward, which we profoundly believed in and we still believe in, such as the Green New Deal for Europe, Remain and Reform, whatever that would have meant at the time, were defeated. And I don't mean to say this to discourage what we're doing, but precisely to encourage it more. I'm quite fond of the phrase that the historian Eric Hobsbawm used, where he says, "Nothing sharpens the historian's mind like defeat." And with these personal defeats, we've got to learn a lesson. And that is to find the strength that we often forget we have, which is pluralism in the true liberal sense of ideas within our movement. And DiEM, I've always seen DiEM as the one political force that can surpass divisions created by ideas without action. We have these grand debates which polarize us, and on both sides, both on the left and the right, sadly, we failed to carry them through to their potential. We say what we mean, but don't act on it. Yet within DiEM, we have and must focus on the action that we can bring in our communities. And I think where it's almost a paradox when we have a wealth of ideas, we forget that there need to be people to hear them and to feel the effect of them. So something I'd be very keen, or DiEM in the UK, to do is to go into the communities, to work in food banks. And I'm sure Gabriel will talk about how to live, how life in coronavirus has led to us needing to reconsider daily habits such as food supply or use of free time. We need to orient these ideas within a concrete vision for how we act, which means how we live every day. And going back to these defeats, I don't think, frankly, it is a question of the Labour Party or the Green Party, Keir Starmer or Jeremy Corbyn. It's not a point of dwelling on these defeats and taking them as closed chapters, but to use them as lessons, examples, and provocations. History shouldn't end with them. We should not use history to make points for us. It should only be a curve on which we sit at the further end of it. I wouldn't dwell on Jeremy Corbyn's defeat, because our strength is in those ideas, not the man. And if very quickly I can say, the strength that DiEM has, which it shares with the British left, is a diversity of organising power and ideas. Since the 1900s, the Labour Party was set up of 10 to 12 different groups of different traditions, but they were still the same party that helped in the general strike of 1926, governed the Home Front in the 1940s with remarkable empowerment. So we shouldn't be scared of these debates. We shouldn't call it lost the moment we lose the limelight, but prove the point off the back of defeats, which should sharpen our mind and our thoughts, if you'd like that.
Thanks, Jack. Thank you very much for that and for the inspiring and positive sort of message. It's true that Jeremy Corbyn's time as a leader of the Labour Party galvanized a big part of the British left that had sort of fallen into a hiatus, if you like, or during the Blairite period. So those people now are in need of a continuation for that struggle that began with Jeremy Corbyn. And DiEM25 is more relevant than ever in exactly that struggle, making sure that it remains relevant and topical. Unfortunately, Rosemary to the rescue. I was about to say our gender parity is going to the dogs, but now we can have Rosemary. So Rosemary, floor is yours. Go ahead.
I don't think the Labour Party is quite over yet, and there are an awful lot of active members in it who are trying to think now about what the organizational challenge means for them. I think this is terribly important in this era of coronavirus, because I do think that the basic dynamic we're seeing now is the conflict between collaboration on the one hand, solidarity, which is a word that the government doesn't use, and on the other, the whole question of capitalist competition, warmongering, and the continuation of the polarization of our societies, which we knew very well from the whole Brexit period. Of course, the UK wasn't alone in having that polarization in its midst, but I do think we have to think about that. I don't think we can just say Remainers and Leavers have to bury the hatchet because it's over. If we are going into a no-deal period, and it looks as if we are, when no deal was the one decision that the British Parliament managed to consistently fight against and got completely ignored, then at the very least we have to register the fact that we're in the middle of a profound democratic crisis. And I think for me, this is the real issue. Again, I'm quite interested in parallels with other European countries. I'm interested in the parallel with France, where there was this lengthy and extended state of exception because of the terrorist attacks. And now we're seeing the repeat of the development of a kind of surveillance state, this Jupiterian state of Macron's, taking advantage of what was established in that period. And I feel that for us in the UK, the Brexit years were exactly the same thing. They were a coordinated attack on our democracy, starting with the destruction of parliamentary sovereignty, but actually an extended attack on our deliberative and democratic culture at every level. And this now, is something that we can see being picked up in the coronavirus era. I mean, there are tiny little signals every day. So, for example, in these peculiar presentations that the government does as its way of communicating with the nation, they've banished the Sunday Times and Channel 4 recently simply for criticizing some of their incredibly controversial coronavirus policy making. And at the same time, they've instituted an innovation, which is that the public are allowed to put one or two questions. Now, this is actually, if you read the signs in the UK, a classic populist position. It's warning the media that if they don't play the game, they will be out on their ear because Boris Johnson is going to build on the reputation that he's already tried to build for himself as a defender of the people, and in particular, the unitary will of the people against parliamentary elites, the judiciary, the civil service, the BBC, the mainstream press, whoever challenges. I think actually this has led to real dangers in policymaking over coronavirus. And these are the sorts of issues I think DiEM25 is going to have to intervene on, because where I absolutely agree with Jack is that we have to be, yes, about rational policymaking and rage, but also we have to be about empowerment. And the issue really is whether we can begin to help empower all those people who turn out to be absolutely indispensable for the health of all our nations, who are the most vulnerable and the most beleaguered at this moment in time and the most hard done by.
Thank you for that, Rosemary. Next up, we've got John. Hang on, John, you're still muted. I'll unmute you. There you go. Go again.
Got me. Hello, 1, 2, 3. I just wanted to preface my following remarks by just reiterating the point that I don't think anyone's under too many illusions here as to the projected role of DiEM25 UK within the broader project. You know, that is to say, Brexit afterlives, where we do raise this in our engagements and meetings, and membership seem quite clear on this. Now, I was planning to just rehearse some basic points, which seem a little bit superfluous because they're blindingly obvious, but they do cover some points that I would like to make initially regarding business as usual and the mesmerization of the right and the centre, which is speaking to the Tories and Labour right effectively, who are bereft of an adequate response at the moment. Spending targets and the logic of spending targets exposed and ridiculed, conceptual floats for infrastructure tinkering gone, irrelevant. So the sprint's on now for claims to the ellipsis leading out of corona crisis, with all of those working assumptions. And practically, what that means is the virtual saturation of government and opposition benches in the UK. So with one of the fundamental logics at the heart of the 40-year plan, which I think of as just-in-timeism, that's been structurally laid bare in its abject lack of flex built into the healthcare system. So that's obviated. And that logic also speaks to the invoking of what amounts, as far as I'm concerned, to the doctrine of hostile environment, which has seeped out of May's Home Office and into every institution across all of the interfaces between the people and the state. And more than this, we see it on a daily basis, revealing itself in every act of infantilization, coming out of Number 10, coming from BBC editorial rooms, any interaction with the state and its organs. And we are besieged with anecdotal evidence on this on a daily basis also. What we see is individuals with problems who are unable to act because of the infantilized mindset that has been propagated. So this is a fundamental problem which I'd like to come back to. Also exposed is the neglect of the right into attending to their own common sense tropes. And this is an important factor for me. Common sense tropes that they typically and historically rely on to buttress ideological consumption of capitalism. So what we've seen during the coronavirus is some of the dormant collectivist reflexes that we kind of vaguely understood as having sort of disappeared from the landscape are being reanimated in the British people. And I think we can see that in some of the ashen faces at the lecterns at CV19 briefings. So I wanted to go on to some of the bullet points, the tenets of DiEM25 programs and platforms that I hope that we can cover in the scope of our discussions today. And these would include hyper-austerity, democratic degradation, corruption of the public sphere, constructive disobedience, and justice, specifically access to justice. Perhaps come back to those. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, John. And if you could paste those bullet points in the chat for all the participants to see, I think that would be very helpful to instruct their own interventions. Thank you very much for bringing those to the table. Next up, we have Ivana from the CC. If I could ask all of you, because we've gotten this comment on the chat on YouTube from the people watching us, if I could ask all of you, when you take the floor, to briefly introduce yourselves, your names, and the body of DiEM that you're representing, and so on. I think that would help our audience a lot. Thank you. Ivana.
Hi, I'm Ivana. I'm from Serbia. And I'm a member of Coordinating Collective, but I'm also a coordinator of DSC Belgrade for 4 years now. And I'm especially glad because of Yanis' introduction and the mention of DiEM's relation to Europe and not to the EU. Because it was a challenging moment for us in Belgrade when we joined. How do we relate to EU while we are not the member state, and we are in this long, long road of being maybe accepted? So I was kind of being anxious to see what happens with Brexit, because I saw a huge opportunity in making the unified front with UK and Turkey and other non-EU states in making the way for united Europe, which is the way after this corona crisis. If you ask me, that would be what a dream come true, and what DiEM is all about. The most maybe picturesque example now is a need of European healthcare system. And that's something that I believe that a couple of our countries could work on and present those. Also a point of being able of having our own national central banks and being able to print money is a huge value that we should look into and develop our programs, Green New Deal, especially the parts of basic goods, job guarantee, UBD, to our local national contexts. I would be looking forward to collaborating with UK and see about that.
Thank you very much, Ivana. Thank you for bringing that topic to the table. The idea of Europe has been an idea. It's been in European heads for thousands of years, and it's never meant the same thing. And at a time of a European Union that is trying to sort of identify itself with an entire continent and an entire rich cultural history and backstory that goes with it, it's very important to remind ourselves that Europe is not the European Union, and vice versa. And the story of Brexit is an instruction in exactly this concept. So thank you for bringing it in this slide. Next up, I believe we have, I think we have Gabriel. If I'm wrong, I'm terribly sorry in advance. But Gabriel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, I'm very interested to hear more about Ivana's ideas on how to make a unified Europe beyond the EU, because that's something that is very badly needed. So my name is Gabriel. I am part of the UK National Collective, and for the past few years I've been coordinating some of the work that we've been doing on Brexit. And I'm really glad we're getting a chance to have this kind of public discussion right now, because we've been through a bit of a journey. And I want to kind of pick up from what Jack was saying about the two failures that we've seen in this country in 2016 and 2019, which I'm seeing as two wake-up calls that we've had in these years. So, you know, quite literally waking up the day after the 2016 referendum was shocking for everyone in the UK, and I think for lots of people outside of the UK, having that realization that where the country that we're sharing with other people isn't what we thought we were, and that there is this gulf between the way in which different people think about the country and that implication that might have. And so our approach in DiEM25, and I think the progressive approach in the UK in general, has been to say, the message of another Europe is possible. There is another Europe that exists beyond the EU, and this is something that is worth fighting for beyond Brexit and beyond the prospect of leaving the EU or not. But there is perhaps something that we might have missed out on, and maybe we only realised it's too late with the 2019 general election, is that in wanting to show that there is a transnational public, there is a transnational demos, even though maybe it's only in this formative early stages and we still don't know how it's going to develop. We might have missed out on some opportunities to really kind of go deep into speaking with our neighbours and building those kinds of grassroots local connections that we might have done. But I think, ultimately DiEM25's original position on Brexit, which was to accept the Brexit referendum and try to work with it. And if you remember, that was also Labour's remarkably successful position in 2017. That was the right interpretation. We kind of collided with reality then because the Brexit debate went into the direction that we did, and trying to hold the line between Leave and Remain. It just, we saw the result of that, I think, in 2019. I don't think we can boil down the 2019 election results just to Jeremy Corbyn being pushed to support and Remain, although that definitely did a lot of harm to the Labour's messaging. It was a disaster, and it had many different reasons that I don't think we're going to have the time or the inclination to get into right now. But that was another wake-up call for me personally and for everyone I've spoken to. And that was, I think something which maybe DiEM25 in particular has to learn from that 2019 general election result, because Labour did have all the right policies, it had the right attitude to people, and yet it failed completely to get its message across. And that was, that was a real shock, especially for people. And I know there are several people in this group who put in a lot of work and a lot of time and put the whole heart and soul into making sure Labour did as well as it could. And just the result was, it was disastrous. But my feeling, and I know a lot of people who've also felt this way after that 2019 general election, is that we kind of have to start over from square one. We are not going to be able to make these changes that we want to see, on a transnational scale, unless we start working from the ground up, unless we start building the kind of the grassroots empowerment that Rosemary was also talking about. And this is work that we're going to have to do inside and also outside of DiEM25. And I think, a blessing in disguise we might have gotten from the coronavirus crisis is that now we're having an opportunity to do exactly that. There has been a true explosion of solidarity all across Europe. I've seen this and I've done some research on my own in London and across the UK, talking to people who really now more than ever are feeling the need to build these networks. And we realise now with the coronavirus crisis and for the split second that the Tory party started espousing socialist policies, that the minute these things hit the fan, then we realise that there is only society, and that's where we should start. So I completely welcome the idea of building a united front for a united Europe, but I think DiEM25's role in the future in the UK, and I think in other countries as well, must be to make itself relevant and to really listen to what people have to say and kinds of changes people want to see in their daily lives. Because otherwise we will, endlessly repeat the cycle of what led to Labour's election after 2019, which was not being able to get its message across to the right people that need to hear that.
Right, cheers, Gabriel. I think we're on third through our call now. I think this might be a good point at which to start reflecting on some of the things that have already been said. I'd like to invite people to request the floor on that basis. I think I already have a stack from Yanis, so we can start with Yanis, and then please let me know who else would like the floor. Yanis, go ahead.
My main concern is the way forward, like I think everybody else. But it is important to reflect before pushing forward. So I'll try to do both, and I'll respond to what you said, Gabriel, now, and what Rosemary said before about empowerment. Before making a suggestion, look, Gabriel, what I think was catastrophic for Labour was, and that is what essentially allowed Boris Johnson to run away with it, was that, and this is something that we've been saying as DiEM25, after the Brexit referendum, after the referendum was won by the Brexiteers, there were only two possible outcomes that made logical sense. One was a hard Brexit, and the other was Norway Plus. Nothing else could work. Rosemary, you said, you used the example of Parliament staunchly rejecting no deal, and yet no deal being the outcome, as an example of the diminution of democracy. I disagree with you on that, you know that. The Parliament was entirely stupid to vote for no deal, because this is not something you can vote for. Vote against no deal, because when you are engaged in a harsh negotiation between two entities, the Parliament of the one entity, if it says no deal is out off the table, then effectively that's saying surrender to the other side. If we wanted to avoid no deal, we should have not argued against no deal. We should have argued for Norway Plus and say nothing goes other than Norway Plus, because this was such a gift, to keep saying no deal, take no deal off the table. How are we going to take no deal off the table? The only way you can take no deal off the table, the only way you can eliminate the possibility of no deal, is to surrender to Michel Barnier. Now, that was such a gift to Boris Johnson. And also, Rosemary, allow me to say that the British Parliament has never been particularly democratic, even when it had a solid majority over something. You have first past the post. It is a terrible system. It is completely anti-deliberative. It is an old boys Oxford Union kind of disgraceful forum. So let's not say, the sovereignty of Parliament, the Parliament wanted this, and yet it was usurped. It was usurped because it deserved to be usurped, not for this particular issue. But when we talk about citizen assemblies, when we talk about deliberative democracy, we don't mean defending this particular Parliament. Most of the people who wanted to stay in the EU, by the way, didn't give a damn about the people. They didn't give a damn about deliberative democracy. They just didn't want their particular privileges that were nicely safeguarded by the EU to be done away. And that, I think, we need to be self-critical also about some of our nearest, some of our comrades or former comrades. I remember the great disappointment I felt with Another Europe is Possible, the organization, when we were about to merge as Another Europe is Possible and DiEM25 UK. And at the very last moment, they put a precondition to the merger. And the precondition to the merger is that all DiEM decisions regarding the UK must be taken by the UK lot. So effectively, they wanted Brexit within DiEM in order to join DiEM. So, democracy, deliberative democracy, Parliament, Brexit, and so on, create a very interesting complex mosaic that we must be very careful how to unpick. And I seriously do believe that that the DiEM25 position was the only one that was actually very well thought out, very nuanced, and could have been the basis for a Labour victory. Had Jeremy Corbyn from the beginning said, okay, I respect Brexit, no second referendum, we will fight and we'll kick and scream until we get Norway Plus, then he would have changed the agenda. But he was not even allowed to do this because of the leavers in his party and the remainers in his party. Anyway, that's my assessment of the situation. I'm now going to go to to the main point, which is the one that Rosemary raised: empowerment. If DiEM25 is going to be anything other than a Zoom meeting of a few people having a very nice time talking to one another, if we're going to be influential in any kind of way, we will only achieve it if we do, as Rosemary said, if we bring to the debates amongst progressives in Britain something that empowers them, a process which adds value to their thinking, their participation, their analysis, their activism. And here's my proposal, and that's how I conclude. Lofty ideas about another Europe, and how we want to construct a European demos. We can have this discussion over drinks, but it is completely and utterly pointless. People out there are worried about their jobs, they're worried about their health, they're worried about the prospects of their kids. If you go to them and talk to them now about Europe, they say, go away, just get off my porch at the moment, right? And quite right to so. Who gives a damn about Europe when you have such a deep-seated existentialist angst and crisis? So unless we, as DiEM25 UK and DiEM25 more generally, can identify particular actions, some kind of dispute between nurses in some particular NHS hospital or area and management. Warehouse workers, workers working in some company that's about to close down because of the crisis and so on. Unless we can identify such clashes, such instances of political and class-based conflict, and intervene by creating a pan-European campaign to support these particular people, the particular people that need our solidarity and support in Wolverhampton, in Scotland, in Wales. Unless we can do that, we are useless. But I think we can. This is how you demonstrate the power of Europe. If you create a pan-European action to support workers in Wolverhampton next week, right? Then this is radical Europeanism in action. It is not a lecture on the importance of creating a European demos. But that is your job. It is your job to identify these instances of collective action, and it is our job outside the UK to provide the support, the guidance, the resources, or whatever. Thank you.
Thanks, Yanis. We'll go to Fotini, and then I will go through some questions that we've been receiving as well to further enrich the discussion. So Fotini, go ahead.
Thanks, Eric. I'm Fotini. I'm a member of the CC. Just a few thoughts that came to mind. I'm mostly covered by all the comrades that have spoken before me. Just to say that I completely agree that the DiEM25 is currently more relevant than ever, as Europe, as we all understand, is not only the EU, it's Serbia, it's the UK. And especially if we keep in mind that the current pandemic will bring up on many countries, Greece, UK perhaps, and the Mediterranean ones as well, the other ones, a severe austerity along with a severe economic crisis. I think that it is a field that we should really work on, trying to empower our movement, and therefore I agree with Yanis. We should try and create a plan with concrete, as Srečko would say if he was here, a concrete set of steps that will lead us to our main goal, that is to democratize Europe. However, in order to form that, I think we should keep in mind and try to think of and draft and write a few milestones that we should aim and try to reach, and especially a chronological period, a time frame in order to complete before, because maybe 2025 is things will be even worse until then, and we might need to bring it a bit forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Fotini. And it's really true that, if nothing else, one of the historic duties. And in many ways, one of the most unique contributions that DiEM can do to the European project, a project that has always historically been elitist. It's been among the elites, whether it's the 15th, 16th or 21st century, is to translate Europe into something that is imminently relevant to everyday citizens, to working class people. Europe that actually means something in your ability to bring food to the table, in your ability to fight for your rights. That is not the basis on which Europe has been conceived to this point, but that is the perspective and the approach from which DiEM25 views and approaches Europe. And it's really up to us to take this concept and translate what we've made of it at the European level into something that is relevant to the British, for example, reality, to then the French, the Greek, the Italian reality, translate this ambition into something relevant to the people that we're trying to speak to through our activism. Now, very briefly, a couple of questions that we've been receiving from viewers. One has already been mentioned briefly by Rosemary. How do we practically enforce and implement societal, and I would add democratic, control over mass monitoring and surveillance systems, especially at a time of coronavirus? We've seen the case from Germany and so on, the legal case against what the government was trying to do there. How can the global corporations with a vested interest in reversion to the status quo be persuaded to join in positive change? And perhaps we could add here, can they be persuaded? And if not, what should our position be vis-a-vis these corporations? A question about the Green New Deal for Europe, for our viewers, that is DiEM25's Green Transition and Recovery program now at the time of coronavirus. The question is, this seems like the time for the Green New Deal. What are the more important things we should be doing right now to make the post-COVID recovery plan in Europe and beyond relevant and combine it with our Green New Deal? And finally, I believe that DiEM25 is the group best placed to help reunite progressives in the United Kingdom. What are DiEM's plans going forward? Will setting up an electoral wing be considered soon? As I think in Scottish elections in 2021, and possibly British elections, we could gain a significant number of seats. For our viewers who might not be as familiar with DiEM speak, an electoral wing is a body of DiEM25 specifically mandated and tasked with organizing DiEM25's presence in elections in different countries. So the question is, we don't have that in the UK right now. Are we considering it? So that is some questions that I would like you all to keep in mind in your next interventions. And we go immediately to Buba. Buba, you have the floor.
Hi. So I've been elected to the NC a few years ago. I'm a French citizen living in the UK. So as far as everything, that I agree with a lot of what has been said so far, and especially the aspect being French of taking the EU outside of the EU, given that the UK is leaving the EU, but still being part of Europe. That means, and that's something that we discussed as the UKNC previously, that means there will be a lot of EU citizens living in the UK and therefore without any representation in the European Parliament or in the EU, because I believe that if you're in a third country, you can't vote in EU elections. So one of the things I'd be interested in is to push for a campaign which would empower people to be, well, European citizens living in the UK to still want to be represented inside the European Parliament. So obviously it's not as relevant to UK citizens, but like I said, it's still an opportunity for us to galvanize a group of people that would be interested by everything DiEM25 has to offer. As far as I agree with Gabriel as well when he said that COVID in a way is a blessing in disguise, because we've started something called Outside My Window, where people in the UK get to meet through Zoom and have a chat about, what's happening outside of their window, how they're living the current situation. And this has given us the opportunity to meet a lot of people in the UK that we didn't meet before, which weren't necessarily involved with DiEM25, but are still interested with everything we're trying to do. And I think that could be one of the ways we could discover some collective action opportunities that Yanis was talking about. The more people we can interact with, the more people we can discuss and talk everything DiEM25 has to offer, the more opportunities we have to reach out. So as far as I'm concerned, that's the 2 points. The first one is to reach out to EU citizens. And then the second one is for us to be able to get those collective action opportunities, to find them, is to reach out to UK citizens through the current period, and then expand it and build on everything Outside of My Window will have created to move forward.
Thank you very much, Buba. Up next, we have Arash. Arash, it's yours.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, okay. Hi guys, I'm Arash. I'm in the London DSC and I was invited to join. So yeah, thanks for having me. But anyway, just on the idea of being able to sort of convert all the ideas we're putting forward, or DiEM that I've seen DiEM put forward, have been sort of digested a bit and then often taken forward by others or whatever, but it's not being translated or converted into elections essentially in both Europe and with Labour this time round. And I think one of the issues was specifically with Labour this time around was an issue of sort of communications, as in if we want to be radical, which I personally really do, but populations have to be able to digest policies over a period of time. One of the things I feel, for example, that Bernie did quite successfully, and he was close, he's been very close this time round, is that he picked out 3 or 4 things like healthcare, like job security, like housing, and just hammered them. And he hammered them consistently as part of his movement for 3 or 4 years before this election came round. So just the point, if anything, I'd like to make is essentially is pick out 2 or 3 things that we feel like would matter most to people and just hammer them for as long as we can, essentially, until from now or from as soon as we can. And once we've selected those things, for example, issues, and then those issues translated into the solution and then the policy idea. For example, we've got an issue with energy and CO2 emissions. So then we've got a Green New Deal that would also create job security, and then just hammering that just really, really heavily for as long as, throughout, from as early as possible. And that gives people a time to digest it. So that's the main thing that I wanted to say, really, is just once we've decided on picking out what the issues are, picking the policy to solve them, just pick a handful, only 2 or 3, and this is for the mass public, as it were, and just hammer those things over and over and over again, because we're not going to get the airtime. We're not going to be given airtime. So whenever anyone is given any sort of airtime, take advantage and let those things be digested. That's it really for now. But anyway, I hope it was useful. So yeah.
Arash, it's music to my ears. It's not just useful. It's really, really important to tie in political ideas into something that we can get our hands dirty with. And that's also something that we cannot help with. It's really up to DiEM in the UK to come up with these actions. That's why DiEM UK exists, because nobody can do it better than the people on the ground we would always get it wrong every time if we tried to come up with those ideas from Europe and then stuff it down people's throats in Wolverhampton, like Yanis said. So thank you very much for that, and we're really looking forward. Hopefully this discussion can be the breeding ground, if you like, for some of those ideas, and then with our follow-up calls in the future, we can develop them further and see how we can get, well, hopefully on the streets, if they'll allow us. We're stuck indoors for now, but here's hoping. Right, we've got Felix, you were up next, but I will try and get Cici in first, if that's all right. So we go to Cici, and then Felix, you will be up. So Cici, floor is yours.
Hello, very nice meeting you, and especially Rosemary, whom I haven't seen since Prague. Sorry, I joined you really late and I missed your problematics. I simply want to respond to Arash's intervention, with which I totally agree. I think this is the solution to DiEM UK and to all DiEMs, in fact, okay, to all national DiEMs. However, Arash, because you mentioned Sanders, I was wondering, didn't Jeremy Corbyn do precisely what you were saying, or in fact what Sanders was saying, that is, sort of restore the basic values of national health system, free education, deprived of, without any fees or whatever. Things like state ownership somehow of the trains and so on and so forth. But his message didn't come out very well. I mean, if we judge from the results, of course, he did very well with young people. So what I'm saying is that you are privileged in the UK because you had this wonderful campaign which for us gave much hope, because after almost 40 years of neoliberalism, starting with Thatcher, that these basic socialist ideas were put back on the table, let's say. However, this failed, and my question is addressed to you and to all comrades. The problem it fails about has to do with the European Union. Okay, how would you confront an issue like that, considering that DiEM is a pan-European movement? There is a war there. How could we fight for a Europe that is not identified with the European Union? It is larger than that. And at the same time, a Europe that could be, let's say, post-capitalist. I mean, Yanis's text, the one that he posted with certain thoughts about Brexit and about the post-virus situation, in my opinion, gives the directions, but this is a real problem for you, I think, in the UK. Thank you. And sorry if I went on and on.
No, that's all, Cici, and you touched on something that Ivan, also from the Serbian perspective, touched upon, this idea of a Europe beyond the European Union and what Europe truly is and what DiEM's position vis-a-vis that Europe should be. But great minds think alike and all that. Let's continue. I want to say a couple of things, but I will not abuse my position, my moderating position yet. Let's go to Felix. We've kept you waiting long enough. Felix, go ahead, mate.
Hi. Yeah, my name is Felix. I sit on the NC in the position of ground coordination. And yeah, I've worked previously with the Take a Break from Brexit campaign, have been heavily involved there, citizens' assemblies. Yeah, I think that would sum up what my tune is. There has been a lot of different questions and issues raised. I want to touch on some of them. First of all, the institutional crisis that Brexit has revealed in the UK, rather than caused, as in the inherent flaws in the political system that Yanis has mentioned earlier, we try to address, and I think that is central to DiEM25 UK with citizens' assemblies. Gabriel talked about that before too. Citizens' assemblies, I think, is nothing short of revamping the entire political system in the UK. We've had various ideas and discussions. Some of our members in the DSC that Gabriel has been working in were thinking about rolling constitutional assemblies. I'm already saying citizens' assemblies. Next to the House of Parliament, we've been thinking about regional assemblies, national assemblies, or down to the town hall level, which also brings us, of course, towards engaging and, let's say, giving people agency, which I think is absolutely central to DiEM25 overall. Now, with that being said, I think I can, from my personal point of view, I can't speak for the entire NC or DiEM25 as a whole, answer the question of electoral wings in the UK. I think personally, our battle has to do with citizens' assemblies and revamping the political system in the UK, together with the Labour Party and the progressive parts of the Labour Party that we obviously support and are in contact with, in the direction of more socialist policies, more bottom-up empowerment and grassroots movement. That, of course, also touches on the Green New Deal for Europe. Citizens' assemblies are part of many environmental activists' ideas. So that again ties back into pan-Europeanism, problems that we face, not only as individual nations, but as a continent and the world as a whole. So one more thing I think earlier that Buba mentioned, I quickly wanted to touch on that. I think currently there is a crowdfunding campaign running to fund lawyers who are fighting the fact that the European Union cannot be able to strip its European citizens of their European citizenship. Technically, even if a constituted nation decides to leave that. I think that's worth looking into, just on a personal note. That's all from my part. Nice to be here.
Lovely to have you, Felix. Thanks for being here. Moving on, I think we go back to Rosemary now. Rosemary, you're up.
Yes. Yes, I mean, of course, it's true that we didn't have a great democratic tradition in our houses of parliament to defend. Nevertheless, the problem comes back to then how we could fight for this excellent recommendation of Norway Plus, or how indeed the Labour Party could put forward any notions of alternative ways of interpreting the Brexit referendum vote, and also how on earth we could share with significant numbers of the British people the deficit in democratic processes that was taking place. That, I think, is the key thing. It is about consciousness raising. It does come back to this question about messages, clear messages. How can you get anything over? And I think that we can think of all sorts of ways of doing it. I'm rather hoping that when Jack comes back in, he will talk about Scottish elections, because I know that he's one person on the UK MC who has been thinking about the possibility of an electoral wing in Scotland. But I tend to agree with Felix that for England, the issue really is how to defend democracy at all at any level. And I think if we want concrete projects, and we do, this is a very good time for them. They're really sprouting on all sides. For example, if you take this extraordinary mismanagement of testing in the UK and the effect that this has had in particular in the distinction between hospitals and care homes. Now, again, this is not just a UK issue. In Lombardy, in one of the richest areas of Italy, we had these terrible stories of care workers fleeing from care homes and leaving old people to die. And of course, unless you can get your message over, that just sounds like a set of really terrible decisions by people who should have stayed there and fought the good fight. But if you can get your message over and you can begin to talk about what a scandal it has been, that the front line of the war, as they keep calling it in this country, against coronavirus is being manned by people who are being sent into battle without any armor whatsoever. If you can start doing that, then the fact that we've had to fight tooth and nail to get testing done in these care homes, and that now what we're beginning to discover is that asymptomatic people can be very infectious, both patients and care workers. This has huge implications for how they lift the lockdown, which nobody's talking about in the press. That is, when we say that we have a democratic crisis, we mean that it is completely impossible to get the important messages through. We can follow some of it amongst very intelligent middle-class people commenting on their Twitter feeds, but in terms of its impact actually on the political debate, this is a completely different matter. And so I very much hope that DiEM25 members in the UK will be joining mutual aid groups, those of them that can get out and about and not stuck in their tower like I am. I really hope that they will be supporting people who are helping themselves, helping each other, organizing each other to help each other, because I do think that this nurturing of the collaborative impulse against the whole warmongering which we're seeing start up again now against China, for example, I do think this is going to be where the battle is, between those two forces. And we need to work at whatever level we can, and at all levels, on that.
Thank you, Rosemary. Yanis, would you like to, I believe you have to depart, am I right?
I just want very briefly to make my excuses and apologize for having to leave. There is an interview that I have to do in about 2 minutes that was not scheduled, because we have the case of a hunger striker, a young man who has been shoved out of his cell in the middle of the night and transported to a maximum security prison up in the north of the country. And I came out with a statement, and now I need to be interviewed on this. So, you know, evil never sleeps. So we have to be, you know, to be flexible. Apologies. I really enjoyed it. I wish I could stay for the next, you know, keep doing things and keep planning.
Thanks, Yanis. Occupational hazard. Continuing along what you said, Rosemary, you know, about sending soldiers to the front line without ammunition. Last time anybody did that in Europe, we got the Soviet Union. So, you know, there is this idea that because of the ineptness of the system that is really becoming evident at this time of crisis, and where the priorities really lie in terms of the haves and the have-nots and so on, that this is a time of great crisis, of great suffering for many, but also of great opportunity in terms of ushering in and making mainstream a lot of arguments that we've been saying for a few years now. So, you know, there's always this window that opens in times of crisis. And you know, I'm not going to go into Gramsci now, but I hate being the moderator, I must say, because there's a lot that I'd like to say, but it always feels like you're abusing your position when you do. So I'll bite my tongue and I'll give the floor to John, who I'm sure is going to say something equally interesting. Go ahead, John. You'll need to unmute yourself again, please. Or there we go. I've done it. There you are.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll say something, Eric. Be assured of that. With regards to electoral wins, for me, that's entirely premature. When I say we, I mean all of us across the political sphere are watching Labour at the moment, and there's not a lot else that we can do. So we need to, as current leadership is kind of playing it coyly, depending on how you prefer to analyse it. But we need to see how the Corbyn program is going to be ablated, how that's going to be reduced, and indeed how Starmer's own pledges will be reduced. But we've already seen an example of that in the last week with rent relief, which was that be wiped and now has been wound back to deferred. So that remains to be seen. Coming back to Fatini's point about defining milestones and timeframes and folding that back into the excellent point that Arash made, I'd like to reiterate the importance of a concerted effort into identifying the DiEM25 program themes being related back to issues revolving around healthcare, housing, transport, welfare, energy, and education. Now, I could include more, but for me, those are the big six that, in some crude sense, I prefer to think about as needing to be withdrawn from commodity circulation, but they also happen to be the loci of a lot of suffering. And so coming back to the point that Yanis made earlier on political action now, we are not lacking for any amount of scope for issues, campaigns to defend, but we need to be conscious of bringing that back to people's direct experience. And I think that the process of identification of where we place our efforts has to be arrived at through the crude route map that I've just laid out. And I'm presuming that we are going to discuss what those possibilities might be. So one of the reasons I've raised this is I'm a little bit concerned about the route that we take to these things in this kind of a Zoom discussion, which necessarily, I suppose to some extent, sort of traverses a number of particular suggestions where I could identify something that's particularly close to my heart and that I feel is a viable, plausible candidate for action. But I'd like to have a better understanding of a more methodical approach to achieving that is linked back to the other theme that's been highlighted with empowerment. Now, I've sensed that there's some distancing in emphases with regard to deliberative democracy, but for myself, I regard the work and the planning that we've put into this emphasis to this point as being critical to the point of it is that it should be applicable and an adjunct. That I don't like to use the word, I don't have a better expression than adjunct, but an integral part of whatever we're doing. It's that important. So I'd just like to sort of emphasize that point in making any considerations on how we do proceed. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, John. Let's go to Buba now. Buba, floor is yours.
So I would like to go back to what Cici mentioned earlier in regards to Jeremy Corbyn's message and how it was welcome in the UK. From what I've seen, like in the news, when you talk to people, if anything, his message was very well welcomed because of what Sisi mentioned. People were happy to have someone come up with those kind of solutions which go back to socialism. I think the main issue is his ideas, and pretty much everything else was overridden by Brexit, and that became the core issue. And like Yanis said, the fact that instead of focusing on the social policies, Labour focused on, and I'm saying that as a French citizen, but focused on trying to remain in the EU, especially toward the end, I think reinforced the fact that it was all about Brexit and everything else just moved aside. And therefore, I think the election was lost on Brexit more than it was lost on the message and what Labour Party was trying to push and what DiEM25 is trying to push and all the policies we're focusing on. I think I like what Ara said. To go back on the policies, if Labour did anything wrong apart from Brexit, obviously, it was maybe to have to communicate on too many policies instead of focusing on just a few. And I agree that focusing on 3 of them and just saying this is what we're about would have worked better, like Arash was saying. So as far as DiEM25 is concerned and choosing 3 issues and related policies, it would be nice, and that would be a nice way to empower as well. For people, like I think we have over almost 200 viewers on YouTube right now, and obviously we'll have newsletters, and so it'd be nice to offer people an opportunity to share with us as the NC which direction they would like the UK DiEM25 to go. And also obviously by reaching out to us, if there is a local collective action that could take place, like where they live, something's happening, they know about it, and we don't know about it obviously because we don't live in the same place. It'd be good for them to take that opportunity, either because they're viewing that YouTube video or because they received the newsletter, to get in touch with MC and say, this is happening next to me. Hopefully, like I said earlier, with Outside My Window, we'll get some of those stories. But if anyone who's not attending Outside My Window and is watching that YouTube video or is receiving the newsletter, like I said earlier, just to get in touch, I think would be really good. As far as I'm concerned, the 3 actions I would like us to focus are the local collective action that the members would have come up with. Citizen assembly, I agree with Rosemary as well, is really important. And finally, like I mentioned earlier, trying to push for voting rights for EU citizens living outside of the EU.
Thank you, Buba. Thank you very much. Simona, you've got the floor.
Hi, I'm Simona. I'm Simona Ferlini. I'm of the Coordinating Collective, and I'm from Italy. And our first Beyond the Balcony meeting was exactly with the Italians, and it was the day before the Eurogroup meeting. And Yanis said, it's horrible what's happening out there. It's horrible what shall happen tomorrow. National states shall be allowed to borrow to tackle with the emergency, and in 1 year they will be obliged to give this money back with horrible austerity rules that shall ruin people. This is what we should act about. People are already starving in most European countries. In Italy, it's terrible, and they shall be starving more and more in the future. We shall face a major economic crisis that Europe shall face together or perish. So it will perish if nothing changes. So my concrete proposal is to campaign. We have a 3-point plan on to recover from COVID. We are asking to do the most simple thing that USA is doing, give money in people's task directly to people, and make a major investment plan, an European investment plan. So to answer to Rosemary, it is true that it's very difficult to get message through, but Chomsky taught me that what's important in communication is the frame. It is not the individual message. What we should do is to hammer concepts that aim to our 3-point plan, and I think if this is our basso continuo, our leitmotif, it shall reach people's heads, because it calls on their needs, on their fundamental needs, and on their situation here and now, that is one of starvation, of poverty, of economical bankrupt, that Europe should relieve on in solidarity. So I think it's a quite simple message that we can convey in the simplest ways, hammering on concepts that aim to it.
Thank you, Simona. Gabriel.
Thanks, Eric. I just wanted to echo what Buba just said. Come talk to us. If people who are watching this live stream, if you want to know more about DiEM25, if you want to get involved, if you see that this movement has something to offer to you and you might want to contribute in any way to it, just follow us on Twitter, follow us on Facebook, and in particular, keep an eye on it over the next few days, because next Wednesday at the same time as this call, so 6 p.m. UK time, we'll be having our next open Zoom meeting, and everyone is invited to that, and just to get to know each other and talk a bit about how we're doing and how we're getting through this crisis, but also what can we see ourselves doing after this crisis is done. I also wanted to take the question that was that you mentioned earlier, Eric, about devolution and the electoral win in the UK. So devolution is something that we've talked about for Brexit. One of kind of the things that we kept on coming back to in sort of our group discussions was that what the UK is going through with Brexit is a constitutional moment. It's a moment when all the kind of the democratic crisis that we're seeing in the UK has come to a head, and the way in which Scotland, who voted to remain, was then forced out of the UK, and even the fact that, for instance, there is no such thing as an English parliament. There is only a UK parliament and a Scottish parliament. There are all these, big structural problems in the UK democracy, which in some way or another are going to have to be addressed. And I think we were one of the few organizations, I can think of Compass as being another one, who were saying, even though we have a small voice, obviously, we're saying that the change that is needed is much bigger than just Brexit and just leaving the EU or staying in. But about the electoral wing, this is, again, sort of the way we would go about this, essentially, if any decision to open an electoral wing, happens in the UK. This is going to have to be something which starts from, does it make sense to the people who want to be involved in this? This is not a decision that obviously half a dozen of us on the UKNC can make. And it's not even about offering a political process necessarily that people want to buy into. People are very good at getting on with the stuff that we want to do in their lives. what DiEM25 should do on a grassroots level, and what it has to learn to do all over Europe and in the UK as well, is to listen. I think someone was mentioning this earlier, is to listen to what people have to say, and then that's where you start to build something, I think. And then DiEM25 has something to offer, which is that it is a transnational movement that can kind of offer a different dimension, but it has to be rooted in what people are actually doing. And so, if there is to be an electoral wing, someone mentioned that an electoral wing for Scotland might be an idea. They have a system of proportional representation. It would make more sense perhaps to have an electoral wing in Scotland than at the level of the UK. We could also think of having a DiEM25 party contesting local elections. But these are decisions that will have to be made, in a kind of deliberated way, with lots of people getting involved and weighing up the pros and cons. I guess I just want to flag up one thing, is that DiEM25 UK is in a transitional period. We will be having NC elections at some time in the not so distant future, although we don't have a date for that yet. Speaking for myself personally, I think one of the things that we want to try and do we should try and do, is to make sure that we have a better representation of all parts of the UK that want to be involved in DiEM25. That's it for me.
Cheers, Gabriel. Thank you very much. There should be a form circulating in the chat and on YouTube that you could fill in if you're interested in organizing for DiEM25. You can also find the contact details for the UK National Collective to contact these guys on the DiEM25 website. You click on diem25.org and then go to About Us and National Collectives, and you can find them. So if you're interested, please go ahead. The floor goes to Fotinina. Back to Greece. Fotini.
Back to Greece. So just a short idea as food for thought mainly. Emerging from the something you read that one of our viewers wrote on the chat, a way to combine the post-COVID recovery plan with our New Deal. I think, especially given the fact that unfortunately, this virus is here to stay with us, we should really work on that, and we should create a specific section within our New Deal, especially for, let's name it, our recovery plan for Europe, that would have specific sections for each country. So a recovery plan for Greece, for the UK, for Italy, for Spain, etc., etc. I completely agree with the 6 important factors as John identified them, and perhaps these 6 factors could be the pillars, our pillars in order to establish such a plan. So maybe I'm putting it forward just as some food for thought, but let's keep it in mind and work on it and sleep on it. However, I think that at some point we should really work on that, and in order we can not only democratize Europe, we should, and this is our main plan, but in order to democratize it, we should say it first. Thanks.
Good idea, good priorities. Thanks, Otiri. Up next, we have Arash, I believe. Arash, is back to you.
Yeah, you can hear me all right? Okay, cool. Yeah, just on the idea of picking 2 or 3 points that we would take forward if people are interested, or because we seem like we were considering that. And it sort of ties back into what was it Cece was saying. So what went wrong in 2019, as in, for example, I read in a YouGov poll, 65% of people liked the free broadband to everywhere idea. Everyone wanted us to invest in the NHS. But the classic thing, especially in the UK, that always keeps on coming back is, well, how are you going to pay for it? People always ask, well, how are you going to pay? And for example, I would say, well, stop giving money to the banks, and then it was amazing. 2 days after the election, or on the Friday after the election, I raised the issue of quantitative easing. I said it's unbelievable. This country has spent £435 billion on quantitative easing. That's a third of our entire national debt. And no one in the office knew what quantitative easing was. They'd never even heard of it. This has been going on for and they've done it again now. They've done it again now as a response to this coronavirus crisis. So the point I'm making is essentially whatever, with our three main things, I think a Green New Deal is a great thing because it's economic as well as about renewable energy as well. But I would like those 3 or 4 main things, one of them to be very much based on essentially don't give all the money to the banks. so a way around that. So for example, a nationalization of banks, what Yanis said at the beginning seemed like quite a clever idea. We'd have to, I don't know all the details about that, but the point I would like to make is one of those things should be picked and really hit forward as soon as possible. And that way people will be given time to digest it as well. So 2 things from that. 1, raise the issue of quantitative easing because it's never spoken about. And the second thing is the solution, if it is nationalizing banks, say it early before any election so people have a chance to digest it. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Arash. It's a very good point. And it's one that neoliberalism has moved us away from. Economics is too complicated to be discussed by the average citizen, and this is toxic. This is where democracy goes to die. Or like Wolfgang Schäuble said, yeah, the economy is too important to be left to elections. It's this kind of concept. And although quantitative easing doesn't mean anything to anyone, and it's very easy to fall for the trap of saying, oh, we need to educate people into quantitative easing, telling people let's stop giving money to the rich means something. And although it's very important, a lot of people have been trying to frame those who try to take these kind of very elitist concepts and translate them into language that the voters will understand. You get labeled a populist these days. And this is problematic because there are 2 types of populists. There are the populists who tell people what they want to hear, and there are populists who try and translate politics into something that people can have a conversation about. And it's very important to be squarely and resolutely of the latter sort, and to have a very well defined, very well conceived policy agenda, thought out, not pie in the sky, to have a plan, but the way that plan is communicated is completely different to the way it's written. Those are 2 different things. And we should not be afraid to be labeled populist. To be honest, the greatest service one can do to democracy these days in the 21st century is to be this latter type of populists, latter-day populists. There we go. That's a new name for DiEM. So it's really important not to shy away from that. So thank you for bringing that up. And we go to Ivana.
Yes, picking up on what you just said about populism, which is the word that gives me the allergy reaction. But let's say a more comprehensive narrative that we should offer of all of our policies and ideas and values that we have and that we have developed for past 4 years, but we failed in reaching ordinary people who need the help of those policies. So I completely agree with Arash and Buba and Gabriel and the rest of you guys who said that we absolutely need to translate these policies into more comprehensive, understandable language for people who need those policies and will have direct benefit out of them. Just something that you were saying reminded me of the situation in Serbia or in ex-Yugoslav countries, because I always thought that this misfortunate example of Yugoslavia could be very useful to learn from it, not because we want Yugoslavia back, not because it can be brought back, but because of the example of functional socialist country that was there. It existed, actually. I was born in it. I'm 43 years old, and in those 43 years, I lived through different systems. You know, we starting year 2000, neoliberal system went flooding here, and everything that was national became privatized. So we are moving in the opposite direction, were at least. Now we have these residues, crushed health system, educational system, and so on, but it's still there. So even those little residues can be useful. And also our misfortunate example of how Yugoslavia failed. That's my biggest fear, to tell you honestly, that there will be no peaceful divorce of European Union. And that's something that we should also focus on, because Arash, you're completely right. The question that we get so often and then get discredited because where the money will come from. Well, the money will come from, for example, those military airplanes that went up in Italy the other day, painting the sky in the colors of Italian flag. How much does that cost? How heavily is that polluting? And what it is for, you know? So my message is that don't let the experience of Brexit, don't let the experience of failure of labor, because we here also demonstrated for months to overthrow Milosevic, and then Democratic Party came to power, and those were our guys, but then they failed us. So now you need to find that strength within yourself, not to analyze what was before, because we are good in diagnosis, but how to move forward, how not to get into this apathy, which is lethal, and pick up those fires, those burning issues that you have around you, and that can be protested tomorrow. While we were talking, there is another action here going on, and at 8:05, like noise against the dictatorship. So people get out on their windows and they bang on the pots and so on. So, you know, it's one of the, I can understand people need to vent, but that's one of those actions that are completely useless. You won't achieve anything by it, unfortunately. It's okay, you hear people and you feel solidarity, like, I'm not alone, there are more people against this regime here, but it doesn't achieve anything. Our difference, what DiEM has, is that we can make noise, but when we are heard, we also have the solutions, we also have the policies to offer, which will solve the problems. And that's not populist, that's different from the populist. Only our language, our narrative should be more understandable, I think. Sorry for taking so much time. Thank you.
No, it's all. Thank you, Ivana. Thank you for bringing that perspective again to the conversation. It's really valuable. We have another 4 people waiting to take the floor, and I think they might be the 4 last speakers for the evening, as we're reaching the last 15 minutes of the conversation. So I would ask all of you who take the floor from now on to also try and slowly wrap up and refer back to elements of the conversation had so far, and also keep in mind ways forward, next steps, and so on, that we can pick up in our follow-up. And also for our listeners to be inspired from and potentially get involved on. So thank you, and without further ado, we go to Jack.
Hello, thank you for that, and thank you in particular, Ivana, for that very passionate comment. It's made me think about the how we treat politics. We treat it as something to read in the Sunday paper, rather something that determines what we do every day. Which takes me to, and I hope this will sort of bring all the threads together. As a movement and as politically engaged individuals, we have to forget about the political scene, which means the media and parties. We can be members of them, we can read them, we can contribute to local activity, whatever, that is fine. But the moment we start defining ourselves by those successes and all the defeats, as I mentioned at the start, we start a process of not moving at all. Why? Because the political scene is as unstable as what we're trying to change. And I've been thinking about this. And if I were to characterize the modern world we live in now, it's a world in which we have no time, and we have no money, and we have no time because we have no money, and we have no money because we have no time. And that's the deadlock that prevents us from organizing in authentically democratic ways, in authentically human ways. It stops us, it limits the debates to those who have the time and the money to. Frankly, such as the people, or I assume most of us in this call, and amongst a lot of the progressive electorate. How do you break this cycle is the question to ask. And for me, it's the mission that we prize or should prize in DiEM, and that is of constructive disobedience. That might sound bizarre, but it's, to explain it to the viewers, it's using our skepticism, using our lack of faith in a system as a grounds to improve it, as a way to energize ourselves, because we believe in the end, if not the means. And how do we do this here? And I'll get into the Scottish elections. I think it's two things: showing how it's done, and that is on citizens' assemblies. And citizens' assemblies has to be the model on which we tackle things such as John mentioned, education, welfare, healthcare, where decisions and plans are created by the people who will have to use them, not by policy wonks, not by people who have degrees in management or whatever. Something that is practically perfect, not theoretically ideal. And the second point is on extending the citizens' assemblies approach of basic dirty democracy, as Eric hinted at, to how we run our workplaces and our local governments. Some of you might be familiar with the Preston model. So in the town or city of Preston in England, the local authorities have reshaped the local economy by making it almost self-sufficient, by assigning local contracts to local businesses, not outsourcing, and creating this self-sustaining and sustainable place for thinking and action. So what I suppose I'd like to see, and this is where the elections come in, is where we're at a point where people are willing to put the cross in the box. We might not reach that, and we shouldn't reach that point until we were sure of it. Elections shouldn't be a tool for platforms. They should be an aim long in the distance. But in the meantime, the best thing we can do, and I think DiEM25, despite our flaws and the difficulties we faced with Brexit and the Labour Party, has come up with deeply valuable ways of changing lives restricted by a lack of humanity, a lack of time, and a lack of money. And that is by opening the floor, making our own decisions because we need them, and not because it's a political ideal. So Scottish elections, why not? But we can reach that point and win a landslide if we've done the work beforehand. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. So let's, I don't want to stop the flow with any interruptions from me. So let's go directly to Rosemary. And then after Rosemary, we have Buba. So Rosemary.
Yes, I think everyone can see that the problem here is not defeatism or apathy. It's just knowing, a bit like this conversation, where the hell to start. And, you know, I'd like to add something else into the mix that we haven't talked about very much so far. That's this surveillance business. Those of us who've been involved in Julian Assange's case, who've ever listened to Ed Snowden, know that once they get this kind of geolocation, face recognition, etc., data on you, they know everything about you, and it's very difficult to fight back, and it doesn't tend to get lifted up after whatever particular crisis, no matter how legislatively hedged about in the initial instance, when that's over. So how do we get that message across? Because I'm quite sure the coronavirus is persuading people that privacy is too high a price to pay for yet more vulnerability under these circumstances. I think people are getting very used to the idea that they want to let people know where they are and who they're with and who they've been, and that this might be extremely useful. So this is, you know, this is about how do we share with people the problems and the possibilities. But as Jack says, it's also about how do we get a feeling into people that there's something they can do about it, that there could be a bottom-up sort of biopolitics here, where people can collectively work out what is in their defense and what is not in their defense. And I think that we could begin that now. That's exactly what I meant by sort of talking about the testing that's going on in care homes. It's very clear which information really helps people and which information is, you know, not the information that the one ought to be sharing with the state. And moreover, it's very clear that we need to have debates. Now, on this business of populist explanations and messaging, it's very, very important. But you have to realize that the UK government is a very skillful government. It has its own little populist stories. The housekeeping analogy in the economy is a very important little populist plot that it's saddled the people with for decades, so that we keep thinking, oh my God, if we've borrowed that, we've got to pay it back at the end of the month. And then all of a sudden, coronavirus comes along, and we spend out trillions on keeping the blinking system going. So the question is for us, are we then going to go back after this? And we're all speculating about the day after, and I don't think it's going to come for quite a while, by the way, but the day after, are we really going to go back to the housekeeping analogy because things have become normal? Or how can we actually move things beyond that? So we have to be clever, I think. For example, we can go on and on about the massive defeat in 2019, but one way of putting the defeat in 2019 for Labour was that 2,400 votes more, and we would have been in there, at least with a chance. And the reason why we didn't get those 2,400 votes, one way of reading it, is because Labour was riven with factionalism from its leading parliamentarians who were determined to stop Labour getting into power. They were gunning for the Conservatives. I mean, you have to be able to discuss things like that rather than become defeatist. And it isn't dwelling on the past to start talking about those things. It is actually deciding who's going to decide what recent history is, and past history and recent history, let alone the future. So the last idea I would like to leave us all with is this, that my feeling is that we cannot, I mean, I have to say that I'm really grateful to Simona for raising this very important point about the 3-point COVID plan of DiEM25. I do think that's really valuable. I think it's valuable on a pan-European basis, and I think we should all be pushing it out, and we must look into that. And that this is something that we can do together, and it's been well thought out, and so that's why it's useful. But I do think that everything else that I've been listening to tonight makes me feel that I want to say more than anything else. The definition of a member of DiEM25 ought to be somebody who has either joined or formed a spontaneous activist group in the first year of membership, who by the second or third year of membership can be expected to be a member of 2 or 3 different groups, who is willing to register those interests on a register that is shared with all the members, and who will give permission to be contacted on the basis of those interests. I think unless we can get some complexity into our empowered membership, we're going to find it very hard to talk sensibly about how to go and empower people out there. And so I'm hoping that we can model a few small, effective things like that.
Thank you, Rosemary, and that's definitely something for us to pick up on in our follow-up discussion, when we, the internal discussion about how we can really empower you guys to do your job properly. And on a previous point that you raised, it's really true, and I think that became really obvious very quickly, just like in 2008. When a big crisis hits, the mask slips. And the narratives that build up our reality of why is possible and why isn't kind of fall away. And the most obvious one every time is that when a government tells us that they don't have the money for something, what they're actually telling us is that they don't want to do it. It's really that simple. And really, if there's one thing that we need to keep from this period, is that when this myth of the powerless nation, if you like, it is true that for certain things, the nation state has become obsolete and irrelevant. If you look at the environmental crisis, if you look at the situation around people on the move, if you look at this bigger, the capital, globalized capital and so on. But at the same time, there are a lot of things that have been kept away from people on the pretext that we cannot afford it. And that has been a narrative explicitly designed to hide the fact that a lot of the money, a lot of the capacity of the state has for the past few decades been siphoned off to the rich and the powerful and away from communities. And that's something that we need to remember. We cannot allow for that to be a glimpse of reality during times of crisis. So this needs to be a long-term realization around which to build, not demands, because this isn't something that we need to be asking, but around which to build the plan for which to pursue, on which to persuade people to give the power to someone else who is willing to use this power for the many and not the few. And this is really important, I think, and that's something that when we look at the post-COVID politics and a post-COVID DiEM25, we need to keep that very much at the heart. Now, to finish off today's conversation, I think we're going back to Cici, and I know that Cici has been working very hard on an analysis on a Shakespeare play of Antony and Cleopatra, I think. So I think this is the ideal conversation for you, Cici, to be closer to Shakespeare's compatriots. Doesn't really feel much of a break from work, does it? We can, oh, hang on, Cici, there we go. You're muted. There you go. Now I have unmuted.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Exactly, Eric. I completely forgot to introduce myself. I'm Greg and I'm a member of the CC. Two things. The Green New Deal is very important, but it doesn't cover the post-epidemic Europe, which raises many and very difficult points to be tackled by DiEM. So I think it's important for DiEM as a whole to formulate a strategy for post-epidemic Europe as a whole. Therefore, I'll go back again to Arash's and Bubas's points. I think that they sort of have a common basis, which is it's important for DiEM in the UK to choose 2 or 3, only 2 and 3 important political points, like what Arash suggested. And he said, don't give money to the banks. It sounds perhaps extremist, but it's not at all, because of the post-epidemic crisis, which perhaps in the UK won't be the same as the rest of Europe, because you can produce your own money and Boris might give money to people. For us, it is even tougher, okay? However, it's important thing for DiEM as a pan-European movement to agree on. The reason why I'm saying this, and I'm closing with this, is procedures and ways of promoting things are very important, but at the moment, there has to be a strategy. I'm drawing on the example of Mera, how it came to become a parliamentary party out of nothing, with Yanis being thoroughly vilified and expelled from the political scenery for something like 5 years. 4 years. Why this happened? Because the campaign that convinced me to join Mera, I must say, after I had left Syriza, after the memorandum, I mean, you know, the referendum of 2015 that you might have heard of that. I've been for 20 years a member of Syriza, okay? For me, it was, I mean, the only viable position for Greece to join Mera, because it concentrated on very few things, but that came across to the people like down with the memorandum, down with, you know, the dominance of the banks, down with, you know, the debts and so on and so forth, and looking forward to a different kind of EU that now has been changing into something that this kind of the EU is not the EU of the people, but it is the EU of the banks and the capitalists. So I'm saying 2 or 3 points plus, and I'm closing with this. Okay, severe criticism on Boris's and the government's attitude to the epidemic that has victimized so many thousand British people, for whom I feel great love and sympathy, because I studied at Essex, where I met Yanis when we were students. Thank you.
Thank you, Cici. I've also been looking forward to this call. I also studied in the UK. I think there's a lot of people in Europe that share this background of having been in the UK for their studies, for work. And Britain is a country that is very close to our heart. It is very close to mine. And what happened with Brexit might feel like a national issue, but it's a very deeply European one, I think, for many of us. And I really have enjoyed this conversation. It's brought me a lot of hope about how Britain can remain very, very central to the European project, to DiEM25, and to the political struggle that we all share. So thank you very much, all of you, for being part of it and making it such a joy to moderate. There will be circulating once more a form for those of you watching us who might be interested in helping us organize on the ground in the United Kingdom or further afield. Thank you all for watching us. Apologies to Buba, who had the floor, but we had to skip it because we are over time. Thank you for sticking with us, almost 10 minutes over the clock. And looking forward to seeing you again with us on Saturday morning when we have our chat with our Spanish colleagues. Until then, have a lovely week and see you around. Carpe diem.